liberalism, understood in the way that Tocqueville would have understood it, or Abraham Lincoln, or Adam Smith, one of the first of the liberals of the 18th century, namely, as Smith expressed it, the obvious and simple plan of natural liberty, by which he meant a small state to provide for some things. Neither Adam Smith nor I were anarchists, but a small state, and a state constrained to not massively interfere in the economy. Adam Smith was, of course, arguing against, in the Wealth of Nations, the commercial system, as he called it. That's just to say mercantilism. And from both the left and the right, and even the middle, I think we're reestablishing a kind of mercantilism. The size of the modern state is gigantically larger than it once was, say 100 years ago. And as Lord Acton said famously, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so the dangers to individual liberty are great. Now, one point of terminology that I think we've got to think about. Isaiah Berlin, the great English philosopher who became a historian, an intellectual historian. Actually, I have a chair at Cato called the Isaiah Berlin Chair of Liberal Thought. Made a distinction between what he called negative liberty and positive. Negative liberty is what I'm talking about. It's the constraints on the government relative to individuals, families, corporations, associations. The government of Pennsylvania is not to interfere in the University of Pennsylvania. Now it does, but let's pretend it doesn't. So that's negative. Positive liberty is the provision of goods and services, of opportunities, you might say, by the government. By the government. In 1941, in January, Franklin Roosevelt, in the State of the Union address, spoke of the four freedoms: speech, religion, then freedom from fear. He was speaking in the early days of the Second World War, so fascism was the issue. The fourth one was freedom from want, in accord with his attempts in the 30s to make the country prosperous again, make the United States prosperous again. And freedom from want is, in Berlin's terms, positive. But I think there's a great confusion about this. My friendly acquaintance, Amartya Sen, wrote a book in 1999 called Development as Freedom. And what Amartya meant, and what Martha Nussbaum, his friend and in many ways and co-author, have in mind is that poor people need to be provided with a basic subsistence in order that they're free to exercise their freedom. Now, I think that's a modern and fundamental confusion. In languages like Spanish and the Romance languages generally, or the Germanic languages such as German and Dutch, which have only one word in Spanish, or do it in Italian because I know a little Italian, libertà, and German, Freiheit. They don't have, well, I hesitate to say this because I'm not sure, but there's less of this confusion. Whereas in English, we have two words always. We always have the Germanic word, and then beside it, we have the French or the Latin origin word. And once they meant the same thing, until really the 19th century, liberty and freedom on English tongues meant not being a slave, not being subordinated by physical coercion to some other human being. But this word freedom got out of its cage and expanded to include what we call wealth, income, material sufficiency, enough to eat, healthcare, et cetera, positive liberties in Isaiah Berlin's terms. And here's the problem. If you take this view, and I once held it myself, and I seems on its face quite plausible and sensible, that you can't exercise, if you're starving, you're not in a position to exercise political liberty. A French anti-liberal commentator in the late 19th century said, the law in its magnificence allows both rich and poor to sleep under the bridges. It's a joke. The poor have to sleep under the bridge if they're going to have anything to cover them from the rain, and the rich don't have to because they're rich. So it just seems reasonable that you merge positive and negative liberty into one thing, which in English has become the word freedom. Now, here's the scientific problem with that. If you want to find out, as I do passionately, and want to know what liberty in political sense, not being a slave, not being subordinated to your husband physically, not being subordinated to your master as an apprentice, not being subordinated indeed as a slave to a master, or indeed not being subordinated to the state. As April 15th just happened, we all paid our income tax. That kind of physically coerced, backed by physical power of one human over another. I want to know, and I think so do you, in some moods, I want to know whether or not that causes enrichment. I've written 3 long books claiming that it did. I believe I understand modern economic growth better than many of my colleagues, Doug Norris and so forth. I think I've got the right idea, which is that it's liberalism, an 18th century creation, not older, that permitted people to invent and to make the modern world. It's not investment, it's not exploitation that caused our enrichment. You look around us, here it is. It's liberty. At first constrained, only men with property could vote, gradually expanding to, in say the United States, to end slavery, in Britain in 1867 to extend the franchise to all men, then the anti-colonial movements of the post-Second World War movement again are extending the women's movement in its early versions, 1848 and all that, and then in its modern versions in the 50s and 60s, queer rights and so forth, gradually expanded the scope of permission. So you can't answer that question if you don't make a distinction between negative and positive liberty. If the question is, I think it's a very important scientific question about the history of the modern world, is it the case, as Deirdre says it is, that liberty in this first sense, in this negative sense, makes for prosperity, causes modern economic growth, is the reason we have rich and free countries under challenge, always. You can't know it if you put together income or wealth with not being a slave. So my point that this was meant to be a preliminary sort of vocabulary point, but it's my first main point. My second main point is that the kind of liberty that made the modern world and that characterizes a free society is not one of two popular kinds of well, I should frame it this way. The basic idea and passion of liberalism, 18th century style, is equality. Adam Smith was, for his time, a convinced egalitarian. He was, for all his life, unlike many of the Americans he admired, he was an abolitionist. He was against slavery. He's a man about equality of rich and poor, black and white, whatever. The old theory, since the invention of agriculture, is that kings always win and women always lose. That's the hierarchical principle that our friends, the conservatives, to this day admire. Inherited or intrinsic superiority of men to women, whites to blacks, British or French or Spanish or Portuguese to colonies and so forth, is the conservative marching song. And what's unusual about 18th century liberalism then is its egalitarianism. That's the core liberal idea, that we're all, what's due to us is equal dignity, regardless of our condition in life. Well, there are two programs associated with this, which I said a few minutes ago are popular. One is the socialist program, which that I advocated when I was a teenager and slowly extracted myself from, of equal outcome in the race of life. Think of life as a race. Here's the beginning, here's the finish line. The promise of socialism is said to be equality of outcome. In the ideal socialist society, brain scientists and street sweepers make the same amount. We're equal. We cross the finish line. This sometimes happens in bicycle races. I've seen it happen where they hold arms and cross the line at the same point. And egalitarianism of outcome. Well, my proposition is that that works very well in a family or a small group of friends. If I buy a pizza for the party and I say, well, I paid for it, I'm going to eat all of it. I'm not being a friend. So in small groups, this egalitarianism of outcome is feasible. In a family, true, the mother and the father are kind of the bosses, but at least you're supposed to treat all the children equally. We find it quite objectionable if Cinderella is left at home while her sisters are able to go to the ball and strive to get the hand of the prince. So that's the socialist ideal, but it doesn't work in big organizations or in big gatherings of people. Indeed, in organizations, in corporations, and in armies, what works is orders from the top, and what they call in the army unit cohesion. In the small groups that make up the large army, in a company of men, say, they must love each other, almost in a homoerotic way, but in any case, they must care for each other because in battle, that's absolutely essential. They can't say, well, I'm a maximizing utility under constraint person, and I'm going to run away when the first shot is fired. That's not going to work. So in small groups and in groups of command, this equality, at least among the friends or among the children or the subordinates, works just fine. And it's an ordinary human tendency, and it's just fine. But it doesn't work at the level of what Hayek called the Great Society. It doesn't work in 332 million people. So that's equality of outcome. Then there's equality of opportunity. And for decades, I thought, well, that's right. That's only fair. We should have equality at the starting line. But I've grown increasingly clear that it's obvious that we can't have equality of opportunity. And that often our attempts to achieve it, as is also true of the equality of outcome, result in tyranny, in the opposite of a free society. Now, look, if it happened that everyone had the same quality of parent, if everyone was born in the same place, in Paris instead of South Sudan, if everyone had the same, I don't know, mathematical ability or dancing ability or singing ability. You're all Ella Fitzgerald or Frank Sinatra. That would be fine with me. I'm a liberal. I'm an egalitarian. Yes. Equal starting line. But it can't be achieved. We're too different. In some, actually, what's nice about the equality that I'm going to articulate in a few seconds is that it results in the kind of cliche is the rising of all boats. If at the 2% per year that the World Bank reckons world real income is increasing and has been increasing for a long time, continues as the World Bank and in its great wisdom thinks it's going to, if we don't screw it up, in something over a century, income per head, which is now in the world about $50 a day, think of Brazil or China, both have about the same per capita income now, is going to increase by a factor of 8. So instead of $50 a day, we'll have $400 a day. The current income in Switzerland is $180 a day. In the United States, it's $130 or $140 a day. So in a little over a century, if we just carry on the way we are, we're going to be immensely rich. And then maybe this equality of both outcome and at the starting line are going to be roughly correct. Look at the history of China over the last 40 years. Once unspeakably poor at $2 a day. Now, as I said, $50 a day. So neither of the popular equalities are possible. What's possible? Equality of permission. Women should be allowed to be airline pilots. Blacks should not be people's slaves. Queers should not be attacked by the police all the time. People should be permitted, just permitted to, in the race analogy, they're permitted to join the race, regardless of where they start. And that, I claim, as a scientific proposition, means this, that I've mixed in philosophical and scientific arguments here, but as a scientific proposition, as I just said, liberty of permission leads massively to enrichment. And I claim that it's not the state that made us rich. It's not the clumsy attempts at equality of outcome or equality of opportunity. The clumsy and often corrupted and interested policies where the public schools become instruments of the teachers' unions and not instruments of creating equality of opportunity in the children, for example. Those didn't make us rich. To be, say, maybe very similar point, trade unions didn't make us rich either. I belonged to 2 trade unions in my life. I didn't expect to be enriched by either of them. What enriched us was innovation, not capital accumulation, not growth theory, its various forms, not exploitation, to look on the Marxist side. But my favorite example, I can always point to it in any institution, dropped ceilings. Notice these ceilings, they're dropped and all the stuff is behind them. Isn't that nice? The cameras, the inexpensive steel, inexpensive wood, inexpensive clothing, inexpensive books, inexpensive, the enormous enrichment of the last 2 centuries. And I'm going to end now, but I want to put forward one scientific fact, one observation, that any explanation of this enrichment or the free societies in which we live, to the extent we do, has to face up to. And that is that the magnitude, I'm a quantitative person, I'm an economic historian, I was trained by engineers. I want to ask always, how big, how big, how big? And the increase since 1800 in income per head is $2 a day worldwide, with the exception of a few lords and priests, to $50 a day for the globe. Not every single part of it has shared in this, but on average, $2 to $50, a factor of 25, with still higher instances of this, such as the United States or Britain, which in 1800 were earning about $6 a day, which is still, imagine trying to live in Philadelphia on $6 a day. Now earning $100 or $130 a day. You can't pretend that redistribution, for example, will achieve that kind of change in income per head of us all, or of the poor among us. What achieved the enrichment in absolute terms of the poor of, say, the United States is invention. I would propose, here I will in fact end, that we stop calling it capitalism, which is from the scientific point of view is an extremely silly word, because it says, well, capital accumulation is what happened to us. That's what caused everything. And that's wrong. It's just factually wrong. I propose that we start calling it innovism, because that's what liberty, equality of permission, invited. It inspirited people to have a go, as the English say, to experiment, to try and fail, to try then eventually to succeed. And out of that came the modern world. And we must protect it. Thank you.
Thank you. So the way in which we will proceed is perhaps I will have some questions from the internet, and then you can ask directly. So the first question is, we can agree that liberalism caused the great enrichment, but what caused liberalism?
You've got to read the third book of my trilogy. I was inspired this morning to bring it along to my office at Cato. Let's see if I can pull it out. Yeah, here we go. For that, you've got to read this book. It's 1,700 pages. No, not 17. It's 700 pages long. And it tells how it happened. And it has all kinds of evidence. There's this underlying quantitative point. Then there are lots of qualitative arguments that need to be made. For example, in the time of Shakespeare, the middle class, the people in business, were held in contempt. Shakespeare, though himself in business, all his heroes are either otherworldly creatures or aristocrats. They speak in blank verse in his plays. Everyone else speaks in comical prose. By the time of Jane Austen, 200 years later, Jane is amiable, one of her favorite words, towards farmers, you know, Ricardian sense, the entrepreneurs in between the landlords and the laborers. One of her brothers became a banker in London. She's not hostile to the bourgeoisie. But that's not the only argument that's made in this book. I have the other two volumes are only 500 pages long. But I invite you to read them. You don't have to read every word to kind of get the point. In fact, I always, in the beginning of each three of these volumes, I kind of summarize what it is I'm saying.
Okay. A second question is, how do we formalize or operationalize the idea that freedom matters for economic growth? What is the causal mechanism here?
By the causal mechanism, you mean a mathematical statement. I had one, and it's at the end of the second volume. It's a production function, just as a start, which has, of course, Robert Solow's A term, because f of k of L has diminishing returns. Accumulation of capital without innovation, without a new idea of what to do, has sharply diminishing returns. Lots of you own an automobile. Well, if you're married or in a relationship, you might want to have two automobiles, and it'd be nice, it's all right. What would you do with a third automobile? Or a fourth, or a fifth? They would be junk out in front of in your front yard. There'd be no point to them. Diminishing returns. That's been our touchstone for the last 150 years in economics, or indeed, actually since Malthus. So over 200 years. Scarcity, scarcity, scarcity. But it's a finding that gradually dawned on economists starting in the 1950s. Bob Solow's famous 1957 article, calculating the residual, as it came to be called, the A term that you multiply the F of K of L by. Gradually, it's become clearer and clearer that it's not physical capital or even human capital that explains enrichment. It's the A term. And that's innovation. And then you can ask, you can specify, as I do algebraically in that chapter in the end of the second volume, what it depends on. It depends on rents in the economic sense, that is supernormal profits. That's pretty obvious. People don't invent things entirely out of just their desire to be interesting, but it also depends on the esteem, you might call it, with which the middle class is held. In a society in which, say, like Soviet Russia, in which to be bourgeois is a crime, this A term is not going to work as well as it does in a society like the United States, where outside universities especially, business people are held in esteem. So it can be formalized. It's not as if I'm just an English professor, although I was, and I don't like numbers and I don't like math. That's not me. And I believe it can be formalized. You could even put it in an overlapping generations model max U subject to constraints if you want.
Okay, thank you. A third question is, how do the different categories of equality are interrelated between each other? How, for example, does equality of opportunity correlates with equality of outcomes and equality of permission?
If everyone had the same starting one, then it's just a mathematical proposition, as it were, a logical, obvious truth that they would have the same outcome, which is one of the reasons why neither of them works. It would be this perfect, it would be the Garden of Eden, in which we all started as Adam and Eve and ended up as Adam and Eve staying in the garden, God's pets. But we're not God's pets. I've just written a long book on economics and Christianity. I'm an Anglican, I'm an Episcopalian, in which I argue that freedom of the will, as we call it in theology, is connected, is a natural marriage with free markets. In free markets, some people have a good idea, some people don't have a good idea. So there's going to be a variation in income. But my main point about those two equalities, equality of outcome, equality of opportunity, is that they're impossible. Whereas we could do equality of permission this afternoon. We could take away all the hooks and chairs that prevent equality of permission. One simple example of thousands, millions, in fact, hooks and chairs put in the way of liberty, individual and family, is the truth, the fact, in case you don't know, people in this country, whether Americans or not, cannot buy drugs from Canada. How odd, why would that be? Well, because the American drug companies have gotten to the United States Congress and have purchased it for a moderate sum. And the result is that Americans pay upwards of 10 times for prescription drugs than Canadians do. And this is local, this is insane. But this is a result of, I can see from my office at Cato, K Street. You can see it through the buildings. It's this constant irritation because K Street is the street of the lobbyists in Washington. And the K Street lobbyists pay for, there are approximately 1,500 lobbyists, not just their secretaries, but active lobbyists speaking to Congress people and to various people in the administration, 1,500 employed by the American pharmaceutical companies. So there are almost 3 times more lobbyists than there are people in Congress, adding up the House of Representatives and the Senate. This is an inequality of permission. It's got nothing to do with equality of outcome or equality of opportunity, neither, since they're impractical and are often disastrous. We might not care, but in any case, this is a strict piece of equality of permission.
See, a related question to that, and I have 2 questions that follow more or less the same idea.
Probably in the last 10 years, or actually longer, the last 20 years, I've written something like, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000 pages making these points. So I tend to, you press a button and out comes a 50-minute little lecture. So I'll try to control myself.
Yeah, a related question is, we could imagine a world where basically there's equality of permission at the beginning, but then even if the innovator is the one that contributes to the great enrichment by political economy incentives, he could co-opt the institutions and then create an unequal world at the end.
Excellent point and true. It's a rough history of liberalism in the sense that I want to use it, namely the European sense, since the 18th century. Almost immediately, in the United States, for example, the tariff became a political football. New England wanted tariffs against the British cotton and wool and textiles and iron even, but especially those. And the South, which was selling cotton to the British, didn't want a tariff, an external tariff on those, a protective tariff. And indeed, that's the political economy. I just learned this morning, coming up on the train from Tocqueville's great book, Democracy in America. If you haven't read Democracy in America, stop what you're doing and do it. It's an astonishing book. I am fond of saying to my right-wing friends that Karl Marx was the greatest social scientist of the 19th century without compare. Then I say to the left, and he got everything wrong. But I really do think that the only competitor is Tocqueville. It's an astonishingly analytically sophisticated, rich in facts book. And I learned the fact that in 1832, there was an armed uprising in the South, 1832, 30 years before the beginning of the Civil War, an armed uprising in the South against the tariff, armed especially in South Carolina, which, by the way, was the first state to secede from the Union in 1861. So, yes, that's right. So all we can do against this very powerful political economy of interests is to preach against it. And I'm doing it. And I urge you to join me.
Okay, one final question from the assistants here is about the scientific approach, how to approach this from a quantitatively aspect. Is it possible to measure equality, either opportunity, outcome, or permission?
Everybody asks that kind of questions about my books, my recent books. If you look at my earlier books, they're filled with numbers and simulations and so on. I've not, although I was trained well in econometrics for a person of my PhD generation, I didn't ever use it for anything, mostly. But I used what I learned from my engineering colleagues and teachers. I learned simulation, and that's what I mainly do. But they open this book and look at it, and they don't see a lot of tables and numbers. And they think, she's become an English professor or a philosopher and doesn't do real scientific work. Quantification is very important. As I said at the end of my presentation, it's the magnitude that's the problem. And it makes problems for all the, volume 2 is mainly about this, makes problems for all the usual explanations of modern economic growth. Those other explanations are quantitatively unreasonable. They don't have enough oomph, as I call it, to explain a factor of 25 or 30, sometimes a factor of 100 of increase in income per person. So yes, attitudes can be measured roughly, or sometimes, we do public opinion polls now. Why can't we do as it were, public opinion polls on what humans have been writing for 4,000 years. We can do that too. We can count, we can count and assess changes in attitudes of ordinary people and of the elite. We can certainly measure inequality of outcome. Although this present obsession with equality of outcome among economists, I find a little bit pointless, considering the rising of the tide. The enormous rising of the tide makes contemplating equality less interesting, it seems to me. We can do this if we bring all the scientific evidence to bear. Scientific evidence is not the same as having a large sample, allegedly random, and running a hyperplane through it. That's not the same thing as empirical work. A great many of our younger economists are convinced it is, and I wish they'd listen to the engineers or the physicists who never use our econometric techniques. In particular, they never use tests of statistical significance. And if we want to be the physics of the social sciences, maybe we ought to learn a little bit about what actually happens over in physics.
Okay, thank you. Let's open the room for the attendees here. Any question that you have?
Yes, dear.
So, the thing with equality permission, when you started talking about it, I thought you meant equality of being different.
If you could stand up, it'd help.
Okay.
I'm kind of hard of hearing, so
Okay.
so try it again.
That equality of permission, when you started talking about it, I thought you meant equality of being different. But then you
Of
brought
what? Equality?
of being different.
Being different. Well, that's true. Yeah.
But then you
it's
brought
partly
it.
that.
You brought it the race analogy.
Mhm.
And I thought, okay, it's more a sort of like equality of doing. And it seems to be just a subset of inequality of opportunity, equality of opportunity. So it looks like you're narrowing down, because we cannot have equality of opportunity, you're actually narrowing down.
Well, I am.
Into.
I am. Look,
Okay,
I
but it's
am.
not essentially different.
Well, yes, it is, because the attempt to achieve equality of opportunity results in an enormous expansion of the state. It's the justification for having an enormous state. We're going to make people in steel towns equal to other people by imposing a tariff on steel. We're going to have equality of opportunity. No, equality of permission is negative liberty. Both the finish line equality and the starting line equality are positive liberty, which I say it's a perfectly coherent concept. I shouldn't call it incoherent, but I think it's wrong because because we've already got we've already got words for that. Equality of income, wealth, whatever, education, whatever, we can measure those and say, oh no, they're not equal, or they are equal. Whereas equality of permission, look, my rhetorical ambition here is to take back egalitarianism for liberalism. That's my original inspiration. And this essay on equality of permission is going to appear in a collection of essays edited by Cass Sunstein, the nudger, who I don't regard as a real liberal, in about a year, in a magazine published at the New School of Social Research. I'm delighted that my friends, the Marxists there, will have to read this essay of mine. So I haven't got it all worked out, but I think the flag under which we should advance is equality of permission. Men equal to women. Not these other equalities which require statism on a massive scale.
Okay. Another question?
Here's another one.
Can I ask a question like in the sense of who guards the guardians?
Yeah, that's right.
Because
Quis custodiet ipsos custodes. Who guards the very guardians?
because here I imagine that whenever innovations grow in the state, like the questions are online as well, then there's huge and huge incentive for the government to just turn back on the promises and go back to doing equalization.
That's right. There, we can, our masters can promise to let us have the profits of innovation, which spread because of free entry. Someone invents a modern department store, invented, I think, in France, or they invent the, I don't know, the Amazon, or they invent the mail order department store, which is what Amazon is. It's a reinvention of Sears Roebuck, Spiegel catalog, and so forth from long ago. But then people come in and spoil our rents. And so wealth is not permanent. Let's see, I'm sort of losing track of what you asked. What did you ask again?
So basically the innovation do cause growth, but
Yeah, but
suppose we have a bad government that pretends
Yeah.
to be a good government.
Yeah.
To protect innovation.
yeah,
But
yeah,
be a point where it just tips.
yeah. Well, as I said, in answer to this other question of how do you prevent the political economy of the rich taking over the instrument of the state. I think it's the same answer, that an ideology of equality of permission, strict equality, let's not say the word strict, let's just say attempts at equality of permission, which we or some people had, especially in the early 19th century. The new constitutions of Norway and Mexico and so forth in the early 19th century all had this kind of liberal idea. We're not going to have kings always winning and women always losing, although they didn't get to them for quite a while. But we were going to have this new equality of permission. It's ideas that run the world. This is something, again, this amazing Lexi de Tocqueville in Democracy in America and all his other books said. Ideas rule the world. As Keynes said, he said the same thing. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler a few years back. When I was a Keynesian, I delighted in that. So it's in our minds that this has to happen. There's no trick law that will disable attempts at monopoly, government-sponsored monopoly, because I think enterprise monopoly is virtually dead in the modern world. And I have some evidence for that, but government monopoly, hey, taxi cabs before Uber and so forth are monopolies. There's no constitution that can prevent this from happening. There's no constitution that can prevent the equilibrium from being fascism. In short, 1984. There's no social engineering institution. This is one of my main problems with the kind of institutionalism that lots of you think you do. I have another book. I might as well show one of my books. I have 25 books. They haven't sold very well, so I'm very anxious to get more of them selling. This is my book from the University of Chicago Press about neo-institutionalism and how it's mistaken. And the main thing that it's mistaken about is the force of ideas. How do innovations happen? Are innovations caused by corporations or government offices or industrial laboratories or by universities? No. Any innovation in economics, in our own field of economics or economic history, in mechanical engineering, chemistry, legal doctrine and theory, has to come out of some single person's mind. I mean, that's completely obvious, isn't it? Where else do ideas come from? They're in people's minds. Yeah. And they start in one person's mind and then spread, if they do. So it's the job of economists ought to be to understand the, I admit, institutional, geographical, material, intellectual context in which ideas can flourish. Now, if we have universities in which you can't say certain things without being attacked by someone and not being protected by the administration, these individual ideas that form in people's heads are not going to have a chance. So you understand what I'm saying? Look, there are three versions of the Soviet Constitution before its fall. One was under Stalin, 1936, I think it was. Go read it in English. If you know Russian, that's better, but go read it in English. And you'll see that it's a beautiful document. It says, we wouldn't think of coming to your house in the middle of the night and dragging you off to be tortured and then sending you to the gulag. We wouldn't think of interfering with freedom of speech in the great Soviet Union. But this constitution was enforced by thugs who didn't believe it. So our job scientifically is this one I just mentioned, understanding not capital accumulation, which is nice, necessary, but not sufficient, any more than a labor force or the existence of oxygen in the air. For any event, there are an infinite number of necessary conditions. What we're looking for is a small group, smallest we can make it, of sufficiencies. And I'm claiming that it's this liberal idea of the 18th century that freed people when it started to be implemented. If it was never implemented in Russia. It still isn't. Makes for the modern world, makes for enrichment. Yes, dear.
We're thinking, who is doing the permitting? Is it the state? Is
Well,
it you and I?
no, it's not the state. as I just finished saying, there's no trick about the state that you can do. It's public opinion. It's us. A wise possum once said, "We has met the enemy and he is us." I can't think of another word. If you can think of a word that doesn't have this kind of implication that there's someone granting the permission. Someone, say, your husband graciously grants you the permission to be a free person. Well, the hell with that. Right? So that's not how I want to think about it. I want to think about it. Well, let's go back to this point. I want us to get back to, if you want to talk about this way, to the conviction, the general conviction that everyone ought to have equal permission. So it's the society. Again, this is very strong in Tocqueville. Though what is also unusual about Tocqueville is his glinty, sharp, analytic mind that he combines with this interest in liberty. So that's the point. Look, it's like a group of friends, right? There's no one granting equality of permission among a group of good friends. It's the social custom. It's what friendship means in almost every society I can think of, right? Erasmus of Rotterdam, who for his age, which was the early 16th century, was a liberal, although not in full 18th century sense, had a handbook of Latin tags, Latin sayings, hundreds and then actually thousands of them, and he kept issuing new editions. And in every edition, the first one, I won't attempt the Latin just right now, the first one said, "Among friends, all goods are held in common." And when I first saw this, I was very alarmed as a free market economist. What do you mean? What are you, some sort of commie? But no, he simply meant among friends or in a good family. So it's from that, it's from convictions and individual minds that we can get back to a liberal society. I just reviewed a book by Joe Stiglitz, very smart guy, and actually an amiable guy and nice fellow. I like Joe, but he uses the lemma in economic thinking that if there's an externality, there should be government intervention. This is what economists say all the time. It's gotten worse and worse since the 1920s. It gets more and every year. Economists say that more and more things are externalities. If we go down Joe's way, we get a bigger and bigger government. If I was wearing a burnt orange dress, no one here is old enough to remember burnt orange, which was the great color of the 1970s. It's hideous. They painted refrigerators in burnt orange. It was horrible. Suppose I wore a burnt orange dress. You would be offended. Everyone in the room would be horrified. Does that mean we should have a clothing police like in Iran or Saudi Arabia?
a quick comment.
Go ahead.
You know, what you're saying sounds
Doesn't
not
have
so
to be
much
quick, it can be very long.
colloquial stuff, but more like the Pericles, like he was giving the speech in essence. He was talking about the senior democracy being shared by everyone and maintained by everyone.
Yeah, that's right. And the only trouble with the Periclean oration in the 530s at Athens, Pericles died in the plague, and was it 528, something like that?
He did the afterwards.
Yeah, is that we don't know what he actually said. Because the speech comes from Thucydides. And Thucydides made it up. But he was there and he heard it and he knew what it said. But, you know, the trouble with that is the same trouble was Thomas Jefferson saying and writing in 1776, all men are created equal. In Athens, in 5th century Athens, and 4th and 3rd and 2nd century Athens, women didn't count at all. Medics, which meant non-Athenian residents of Athens, didn't count at all. And above all, slaves did not count at all. So this rather small group, about 40 or 50,000 free men, was what Pericles was afraid of. Thomas Jefferson says all men are created equal, pointedly leaving out women. Abigail Adams sent a famous letter to John Adams a couple of months before the Declaration was issued. He was down in Philadelphia talking about it. And she said, remember the ladies in this new country that you're forming. And of course, John just laughed and paid no attention to it. But Thomas Jefferson, they still call it Mr. Jefferson at the University of Virginia, owned slaves that were his own children by Sally Hemings. And when he died in 1826, he didn't free them, as George Washington did for his own slaves. His wife's slaves, he had no control over, but for his own slaves, at least when he died, he freed his slaves. So what's the point of all that? We've got to get beyond the kind of praise of the ancient liberties of the Europeans. This is a universal human value, I claim, equality of permission. It's not European. The Catholic Church didn't create it. It's not an ancient feature of European society. It's new in the 18th century. Long may it reign.
More questions?
Let's give them time to turn over this stuff. Ask questions. See if there's any more. Make sure you're bereft of ideas. Yes, good.
I guess, do you have a reason for your sort of beyond sort of implementability problems of equality of opportunity? Is there sort of other reason to go with equality of permission in terms of like the negative versus positive rights you were talking about?
Well,
And will that prevent people from like sort of, if we're inequality of permission, being like, oh, this other thing would be nice to bring us towards equality?
well, that's the trouble. They'll keep bringing up equality at the finish line and equality at the beginning. But I'm very struck, and in this essay that I think's been circulated or is available, certainly. I make a brief case. It's not a book, it's just an essay. That both of them are completely unattainable. And yet equality of permission, if we get it in our hearts and minds, if we really believe in it, I mean, most people, if we believe in it, we can achieve it pronto. It's not some remote possibility. We'll achieve equality of educational opportunity in 50 years of working on it. No. As I said, this afternoon, if we want. So there is this, as you call it, implementability problem with the other forms of equality. But there's also, for both of them, the economic problem with them. I mean, that's kind of their lack of implementability. They result in poverty. And they encourage envy. They both encourage envy. Whereas equality of permission has this very charming and important feature that it's not envious. If we're all permitted, no woman needs to envy. She wants to be an airline pilot. The laws or the customs of the industry prevent her from being one. And she envies. This actually happened after the war because a lot of women were trained as pilots to run transport within the United States for the military. They were flying all over the place. But after the war, they sort of applied to become commercial pilots, and they said, "No, dear, you go away." So it's the of course, I'm against socialism. I was once a socialist because I thought equality of I thought indeed that the family model could be applied to 332 million people. And I think a lot of us as bourgeois teenagers who don't work on a farm, who don't work in a small business where the apartment is above the shop, so we're helping out. If we grow up with our parents working in upper middle class or middle class jobs, we can easily, when we realize that there are poor people, if we have any heart at all, we want to bring them into our family, into the rule of love. And as a Christian, I'm all for that. But it doesn't work. And indeed, promising it, holding it up as an ideal is mischievous. I mean, Thomas Piketty has done a great deal of damage to the discourse of the West, especially with his scientifically mistaken, but also ethically dubious appeals for socialism. His last book of collected essays called, I think it's called Socialism Now or something like that. I did a review of it. It's shockingly authoritarian. So if we're going to get the boot off our face, equality of permission, liberalism, equality of respect is the way forward. And as I say in this other book I mentioned, they haven't been published. I'm trying to sell it. If you know any publisher who will take it, please tell me. This book on Christianity and economics, that's the theme. That the law of love that Jesus advocated and the law of free entry in markets go together in a way that Jesus of Nazareth did not believe. Yes, dear.
Thank you very much.
Could you stand up so that I can hear it?
I wanted to ask, how do you reconcile the equality of permission with tragedy of commons and public goods management?
With what?
The public goods and the tragedy of commons?
Oh, well, I do it the same way. Eleanor Ostrom did it. The first female winner of the Nobel Prize. And I didn't know her personally, wish I had. But Professor Ostrom, as I'll call her, said that we converse with each other. Frank Knight, the great economist and Iowa economist in the 20s and Chicago economist in the 30s and 40s, came to the conclusion that government by discussion was the best. And that's the same point that Ostrom was making. I've got a lot of thoughts about this question of the tragedy of the commons. I'm working on a book that has a whole chapter on what actually happened in medieval English villages about the tragedy of the commons. And it was solved the way Ostrom and Frank Knight suggested, namely, people got together and prevented it. As it turns out that in grazing, if you put out too many sheep, you don't get any grass next year. And people realize this. They're not a bunch of idiots. And they said, well, geez, we got to stop this. So the word is stint. They would stint how many sheep you could put out. But the more general point is this. Humans are cooperative much more than the non-cooperative game theory that all of you have been taught would suggest. And it doesn't surprise me at all that Ostrom, a woman, realized this. While the guys were talking about, the tragedy of the commons and the prisoner's dilemma, and in the experimentalists like Vernon Smith and Bart Wilson and lots of others were doing experiments to see how people actually behaved. And contrary to other great apes, Bart Wilson has worked with the people in Georgia who have gorillas and chimpanzees whom they love and they take care of, but they also put them in experimental situations. The other great apes are Max U types. They're envious, they're inegalitarian, they're very willing to steal the grape that the other guy has. But in actual experiments with humans, it's not that they're sweetness and light. They sometimes do defect, a lot of times. But to an extraordinary extent, they cooperate. And this is something that behavioral economics has not recognized, which is why I also attack behavioral economics in this book. Or is this the, yeah, this is the attack book. There's another one, short book like this, which is the sweet one. This is the nasty one. The other one's sweet. They're a pair. Published a couple of years ago. I recommend them. In the dictator game, so-called, which is a ridiculous game. The game is you're endowed with $100. You and I are playing it. And you can either give me a share of $100 or walk away as a whole $100. how would you behave, you personally?
Find an agreement, you know,
But
cooperate.
you cooperate to some degree. You might give me $30, that's actually the average. And then the dictator takes 70. Or you might say 50-50. But we're unusual this way. So that's how it's solved. We talk ourselves into cooperation. In a way, that's the core of liberalism. With equality of permission, and it's one of its corollaries is free speech. We talk ourselves into finding not always agreement, but practical common ground between the Israelis and the Gazans, for example. Okay? Go forth and sin no more.
So fortunately, I think we have reached kind of the time frame allocated to the class. So thank you everybody for coming. Well, this is the end of the course for those in the internet. So thank you for being here all the week.
Remind them that all the videos and the slides will be kept on the internet forever.
Yeah. The reminder is that, yeah, all the slides and materials will be in the internet, in the webpage of the course forever. Thank you.